The hum of the airport is a universal language, a symphony of rolling suitcases, muffled announcements, and last-chance goodbyes. But for 16-year-old twins, Ava and Mia Sinclair, that symphony was about to hit a screeching, discordant note. They were bright, ambitious, and on the verge of the summer of a lifetime. What they didn't know was that the boarding pass in their hands was not a ticket to their future, but a front-row seat to a brutal lesson in prejudice. And they had no idea that their father, a man who moved the world's goods for a living, was about to bring the world of one airline to a grinding, screeching halt, unleashing a storm of consequences that no one, least of all them, could ever have predicted. The air in London Heathrow's Terminal 5 was a familiar cocktail of jet fuel Cinnabon and low-grade anxiety. For Ava and Mia Sinclair, however, the dominant scent was anticipation. At 16, they stood on the precipice of everything, their identical faces framed by intricate braids, beaming with the pure, uncut optimism of youth. They were on their way home to New York after a 2-week cultural tour of London, the final luxurious exhale before their real summer began, a highly coveted spot in the Young Artists program at the Juilliard School. Ava the elder by 7 minutes was the talker, the protector. She tapped her foot impatiently, her eyes scanning the chaotic boarding queue for Global Wings Air Flight 117. Her phone buzzed with a text from their father. "Have you boarded yet? Stars, call me when you land. So proud of you both." She smiled. Their father, Robert Sinclair, was their titan, a man whose love was as vast and encompassing as the logistics empire he commanded. Mia, quieter and more observant, was clutching her sketchbook, her charcoal-smudged fingers a testament to the 2 weeks she'd spent trying to capture the soul of London on paper. She felt a nervous flutter in her stomach, the same one she got before a piano recital. This summer wasn't just a camp. It was the first real step towards her dream. A validation that the endless hours she spent with Chopin and Rachmaninoff were leading her somewhere true. They were flying business class, a privilege they knew was exceptional, but had been their normal for as long as they could remember. Their tickets were in order, their passports pristine, their carry-ons filled with books, sheet music, and a modest amount of teenage girl in London shopping spoils. They were by all accounts perfect passengers. As they approached the front of the line, the gate agent, a woman with a severe blonde bob and a name tag that read Karen Miller, offered a smile to the portly businessman in front of them. It was a thin, tight smile, but it was a smile nonetheless. When Ava and Mia stepped up, the smile vanished, replaced by a look of weary scrutiny. "Passports and boarding passes," she said, her voice flat, her hand extended without looking at them. Ava politely handed over their documents. Karen Miller's eyes flicked from the passports to the girls, then back again. A small, almost imperceptible frown line appeared between her eyebrows. She tapped a few keys on her terminal, her movements slow and deliberate. "Ava and Mia Sinclair." She read aloud, drawing the name out as if it tasted strange. She looked up, her gaze sweeping over them from their braids to their new, stylish but sensible trainers. "And where are you two headed?" "Home," Ava said, her voice bright. "New York." "JFK." I can see that Karen snapped her tone, dripping with a condescension that was suddenly sharp and unsettling. She tapped a few more keys. "I'm just going to have to ask you to step to the side for a moment. We need to conduct some additional verification." Ava's smile faltered. "Verification, is there a problem with our tickets?" They had been confirmed and reconfirmed by their father's meticulous personal assistant. A problem was impossible. Please step to the side, Karen repeated, gesturing to a sterile, empty space next to the counter. She refused to make eye contact, instead focusing on the next passenger in line to whom she offered that same thin smile. A cold knot of dread began to form in Mia's stomach. She tugged on Ava's sleeve, her eyes wide with confusion. Ava, ever the protector, gave her a reassuring squeeze. "It's probably just random," she whispered, though the word felt like a lie in her own mouth. They stood to the side, a spectacle of awkwardness. The line shuffled past them. Families, couples, business travelers, all of them glanced at the two black girls being held, their expressions ranging from pity to suspicion. With each passing passenger who was waved through, the word random became more and more absurd. The humiliation was a physical thing, a hot flush that crept up their necks. Ava watched Karen Miller's face, saw the flicker of something ugly and triumphant in her eyes each time she glanced their way. This wasn't protocol. This was a choice. After 10 minutes with the final boarding call echoing through the terminal, Ava decided she'd had enough. She walked back to the counter. "Ma'am," she said, her voice firm but polite. "The flight is about to close." "What exactly is the problem?" Karen looked up, her expression one of feigned surprise, as if she'd forgotten they were there. "As I said, we're verifying your documents. There have been issues with tickets on this route. We have to be careful." The implication hung in the air, thick and poisonous. Issues. Careful. The words were aimed at them, at their blackness, at the assumption that their presence in the business class cabin was an anomaly that needed to be investigated. "Issues with our tickets." Ava pressed, her voice rising slightly. "They were booked months ago. You can see our travel history. We're American citizens. Are you questioning my authority?" Karen's voice dropped, becoming low and dangerous. "I am the final authority on who boards this aircraft. And right now your status is not verified. If you continue with this tone, I'll have you removed from the gate area entirely." Mia, who had followed Ava to the counter, flinched as if struck. Tears welled in her eyes, hot with shame and anger. She saw the jet bridge just beyond the door. She could practically feel the plush seat, see the New York skyline in her mind's eye. It was all right there, and this woman, this stranger with the severe hair and the cold heart, was holding it hostage. "Please," Mia whispered, her voice trembling. "We haven't done anything wrong. We just want to go home." Karen Miller looked at Mia's tear-streaked face, and her expression hardened further, a mask of unyielding, petty power. She took a deep breath, as if enjoying the moment, and delivered the final blow. "Boarding for Global Wings 117 is now closed." She turned her back on them, beginning the process of closing out the flight on her terminal. The hydraulic hiss of the jet bridge door closing was the most final sound they had ever heard. Their plane was leaving without them. They were alone. Two 16-year-old girls abandoned at a gate in a foreign country, their dreams for the summer shattered on the cold, tiled floor of Heathrow Airport. The knot of dread in Mia's stomach had turned into a gaping void of despair. She began to sob, deep, wrenching sobs that shook her entire body. Ava wrapped her arms around her sister, her own eyes burning with a rage so intense it felt white-hot. She wasn't just angry at the injustice. She was furious at her own powerlessness. She looked at Karen Miller, who was now laughing with a uniformed colleague, the crisis of the two girls already forgotten. Powerlessness. It was a feeling Ava Sinclair was not accustomed to, and it was a feeling she would not tolerate. She pulled out her phone, her fingers shaking, but her resolve like steel. She swiped to her favorites and pressed the first name on the list, Dad. The phone rang once. Twice Ava Starr. "You're in the air." Robert Sinclair's voice was warm, cheerful, oblivious. "No, Dad," Ava said, and the dam of her composure broke. "No, we're not. They wouldn't let us on the plane." There was a beat of silence on the other end of the line. The cheerful father was gone. In his place was someone else, someone colder and sharper. "Tell me everything," Robert Sinclair said, his voice now devoid of all warmth, as quiet and deadly as a gathering storm. Robert Sinclair sat in the glass-walled conference room on the 58th floor of the One Vanderbilt skyscraper in Manhattan. Below him, the city buzzed with its usual manic energy. Inside the room, the air was tense. He was in the final stages of a hostile negotiation to acquire a smaller rival logistics firm. The men across the table were sweating their expensive suits, doing little to hide their discomfort under his relentless, surgical dismantling of their position. Robert was in his element. He was a predator, and the corporate world was his hunting ground. His company, Ethelred Logistics, wasn't just a shipping company. It was the circulatory system of global commerce. They didn't just move boxes. They moved everything. They owned fleets of cargo planes, chartered hundreds more, and their ground fleet was a private army of trucks and vans. Crucially, they specialized in time-sensitive, high-value cargo aircraft parts for passenger airlines, medical supplies for hospitals, critical components for tech giants. If a company needed something somewhere yesterday, they called Ethelred. Robert Sinclair had built this empire on one principle: absolute reliability. He was the man who made the world turn on time. When his personal phone vibrated, he glanced at the screen, Ava. His entire demeanor shifted. The predator vanished, replaced by a father. He held up a hand to the stunned executives across the table. "Gentlemen, you'll have to excuse me for a moment." He stood and walked to the corner of the room, turning his back to them, his shoulders softening as he answered. "Ava Starr, you're in the air." Then he heard it. The choked sob in his daughter's voice, the raw pain. "No, Dad. They wouldn't let us on the plane." The world outside the window seemed to freeze. The traffic, the city, the very air in his lungs. He listened, his knuckles turning white as he gripped his phone as Ava recounted the story. The condescending tone, the demand to step aside, the lie about verification, the final dismissive refusal to let them board. He heard Mia crying in the background, a sound that pierced him deeper than any corporate maneuvering ever could. He closed his eyes. He pictured his daughters, not as the privileged children of a CEO, but as he'd always seen them, his brilliant, beautiful, beloved girls. He pictured them standing alone in that terminal, singled out, humiliated, and made to feel like criminals for the crime of being young, successful, and black in a space where someone felt they didn't belong. The father's heart, full of hurt and worry, began to pump ice through his veins. The predator returned, but this was a different beast. This wasn't about business. This was about blood. "Ava, listen to me," he said, his voice now unnervingly calm. "Are you in a safe place? We're still at the gate. The woman. She's just ignoring us. Stay right there. Go to the nearest Global Wings Club lounge. Use my priority pass. Don't talk to anyone else from the airline. I'm going to handle this. I love you both. Tell Mia I love her." "Okay, Dad." Ava sniffled, drawing strength from the steel in his voice. He hung up. He stood motionless for a 10-second eternity. The men at the conference table watched him confused. They saw the shift in his posture, the hardening of his jaw. The temperature in the room seemed to drop by 20 degrees. Robert Sinclair turned around. He looked not at the executives, but at his own Chief Operating Officer David Chen, a man who had been with him for 20 years and who could read his moods like a stock ticker. David Robert said, his voice quiet. "The meeting is over. Our offer is withdrawn. Please show these gentlemen out." The executives stammered, protesting. Robert just stared at them with dead eyes until they fell silent, gathered their papers and scurried out, escorted by a bewildered David Chen. When David returned, Robert was standing at the window staring down at the city. "Rob, what's going on?" "We had them. Global wings." "Air," Robert said, not turning around. "What's our exposure?" David, a master of data, didn't need to look it up. "Significant. We're their primary logistics partner for North American and transatlantic routes. We fly their replacement parts, avionics, even their catering supplies on some routes. We have 3 Ethelred 747 freighters on exclusive lease to them, plus dozens of daily charter contracts. They're a Tier 1 client." Why, Robert turned, and David felt a chill. He had seen Robert angry. He had seen him ruthless. But he had never seen this look before. This was biblical. An hour ago, Robert said, his voice a low growl. "A Global Wings gate agent at Heathrow, named Karen Miller, refused to allow my daughters to board their flight home. She singled them out, humiliated them, and left them stranded." David's face fell. He knew Ava and Mia. He'd watched them grow up. "My God, Rob. Are they okay?" "They will be," Robert said. "You're going to call our head of air freight operations. You're going to call our head of ground transport. Here are your instructions. Effective immediately. Every Ethelred asset assigned to the Global Wings Air is to be grounded. Every flight, every charter, every truck." David stared, his mouth agape. "Rob, what are you saying?" "You don't mean, I mean every single thing," Robert interrupted, his voice rising with controlled fury. "The 747 in Frankfurt, carrying the turbine blades for their A380 fleet, ground it. The convoy of trucks heading to JFK with their international catering supplies, halt it. The charter flight carrying the replacement cockpit avionics to Dallas. Tell the pilot to declare an in-flight maintenance issue and land at the nearest non-Global Wings hub. I want every single piece of our infrastructure that they depend on to cease all movement. I want their operations to seize up, and I want it to happen 5 minutes ago." David was pale. "Rob, the penalties, the collateral damage, this will cost us millions. It will snarl supply chains for a dozen other clients. It's insane. I don't care," Robert snarled. "I built this company on the idea that we can be relied upon. The world relies on us. Today I am deciding that we are not reliable, not for them. I want Marcus Thorne to feel this. Not in his balance sheet tomorrow, David. I want him to feel this in his gut right now." Marcus Thorne was the CEO of Global Wings Air, a man known for his arrogance and his disdain for operational minutiae. David Chen, who had argued with Robert 1,000 times over strategy and finance, knew this was not an argument he could win. He saw the pain behind the rage. This wasn't a CEO making a decision. This was a father waging a war. He nodded slowly. "I'll make the calls," David said. And so the cascade began. In Frankfurt, a pilot preparing to taxi an Ethelred freighter loaded with critical engine parts received a one-line coded message. He shut down his engines, citing an unexpected fault with the cargo locking mechanism. On the M4 motorway outside London, a fleet of trucks carrying everything from de-icing fluid to first-class champagne for Global Wings' entire Heathrow operation pulled over onto the hard shoulder their drivers, suddenly activating their mandatory rest periods. In a control center in Memphis, dispatchers at Ethelred began rerouting dozens of cargo flights, prioritizing any client but Global Wings. Within 45 minutes, the first signs of paralysis began to show. A Global Wings flight in Chicago was delayed, then cancelled because a vital hydraulic part it was expecting on an Ethelred charter never arrived. In Dallas, another was grounded for the same reason. In New York, the international terminal began to run out of specific meals for its premium cabins. At first, it was dismissed as a bad day, a series of unfortunate but unrelated logistical hiccups. But as reports flooded into the Global Wings Operations Center, a pattern began to emerge. The common denominator in every single failure was Ethelred Logistics. The COO of Global Wings frantically tried to call David Chen. The calls went straight to voicemail. He tried Robert Sinclair's office. His assistant informed him that Mr. Sinclair was unavailable, indefinitely. The chaos snowballed. By the 2-hour mark, 6 international flights had been cancelled. A dozen more were indefinitely delayed. The airlines finally tuned just-in-time operational model, which relied entirely on Ethelred's flawless execution, was collapsing in on itself. Marcus Thorne was in a board meeting boasting about Q3 passenger yield projections when his COO burst in his face the color of ash. "We have a catastrophic failure," the COO stammered. "It's Ethelred. They've cut us off. Completely. Nothing is moving. Robert Sinclair has grounded his entire network for us." Marcus Thorne laughed, a sound of pure disbelief. "Don't be ridiculous. That's impossible. Why would he do that?" "We don't know," the COO said, his voice trembling. "But as of right now, Global Wings Air is for all intents and purposes grounded." The laughter died in Thorne's throat. He finally understood. This wasn't a logistical failure. It was an attack, and he had no idea why. He scrambled for his phone, his arrogance evaporating into sheer panic, and dialed Robert Sinclair's private number. The man who could ground the world with a phone call was about to answer, while a multi-billion-dollar airline shuddered and seized Ava, and Mia sat in the sterile luxury of the Global Wings first-class lounge. A sympathetic lounge attendant had brought them sparkling water and a plate of untouched macarons. The lounge was an oasis of calm, insulated from the growing chaos in the main terminal, but for the girls it felt like a gilded cage. On the large television screen, mounted on the wall, a Sky News alert flashed across the bottom of the screen. Global Wings Air facing catastrophic operational failure. Multiple flights cancelled worldwide. Mia stared at the screen, her sketchbook lying forgotten in her lap. "Ava," she whispered, her voice barely audible. Is that because of us?" Ava was watching the same screen, her phone buzzing incessantly with alerts from news apps. A strange mixture of emotions churned within her, a fierce primal surge of vindication, but also a growing sense of dread. The scale of it was terrifying. She had wanted justice. She had wanted the woman at the gate to be held accountable. She had never imagined this. "Dad is handling it," Ava said, trying to sound more confident than she felt. The phrase, which had always been a source of ultimate comfort, now carried a terrifying weight. What did handling it mean when your father was Robert Sinclair? Meanwhile, Marcus Thorne was learning exactly what it meant. His first 3 calls to Robert's personal number were met with the cold digital finality of voicemail. On the 4th try, Robert answered. Thorne. Robert said. His voice was not angry. It was worse. It was utterly devoid of emotion, as if he were discussing a weather report. Rob. For God's sake, what is going on? Thorne blurted out, his voice a frantic squeak. My network is in chaos. They're telling me your planes are grounded. Your trucks are stopped. This is costing me millions by the minute. What in the hell is happening? There was a long pause. Robert let the panic marinate. Heathrow. Robert said finally. Terminal 5. Global Wings Flight 117 to JFK. About 3 hours ago. Thorne was completely baffled. What about it? On that flight, Robert continued, his voice dangerously soft, were my 2 16-year-old daughters. They were flying home, alone. Your gate agent, a woman named Karen Miller, saw fit to deny them boarding. Thorne was still catching up. Denied boarding. There must have been a reason. A ticketing issue. A security flag. The reason Robert interrupted, the ice in his voice cracking to reveal the fire beneath, is that your employee is a prejudiced little tyrant who decided to make an example of 2 young black women. She questioned them, humiliated them in front of a line of people, and then, for her own sick satisfaction, closed the gate in their faces. They are sitting in your lounge right now, crying while your plane is halfway across the Atlantic. The dots connected in Marcus Thorne's mind with the force of a physical blow. This wasn't a technical issue. This wasn't a contract dispute. This was personal, and he had catastrophically underestimated the man on the other end of the line. My God, Thorne whispered. Robert, I had no idea. I am so sorry. No, you're not sorry yet, Marcus, Robert shot back. But you will be. Right now, you're just scared. Sorry is what you'll be when you fully comprehend the consequences of the culture you foster at your airline. What do you want, Rob? Name it. Anything. Thorne was pleading now. The arrogance was gone, replaced by the groveling terror of a man watching his career evaporate in real time. Robert Sinclair laid out his terms. They were not a negotiation. They were an unconditional surrender. First, Robert began. You will find Karen Miller. You will escort her to the lounge where my daughters are waiting. She will apologize to them. Directly. Then you will fire her. Not transfer her. Not suspend her. You will terminate her employment, effective immediately. Done, Thorne said without hesitation. Second, you will issue a public statement from the Global Wings Air. In it, you will apologize by name to Ava and Mia Sinclair. You will state that they were victims of racial profiling by your staff and that your airline failed them completely. You will not use weasel words like, "We regret the incident." You will call it what it was. Thorne hesitated for a fraction of a second. A public admission of racism was brand suicide. Rob a public statement like that. The alternative, Robert said flatly, is that my network remains dark to you. By morning, you won't have an airline, Marcus. You'll have a collection of very expensive, very stationary aluminum tubes. Your stock will be worthless. Your board will fire you. I, on the other hand, will weather the financial hit, and I will have the satisfaction of knowing I dismantled your company because you let a bigot hurt my children. Your choice. Okay, Thorne croaked, his throat dry. Okay. Public statement. Third. Robert continued, twisting the knife. My daughters will not be flying home on one of your commercial jets. They will not be subjected to any more of your staff's judgment. You will charter a private Gulfstream G650. It will be ready to depart from the private aviation terminal at Heathrow in 2 hours. You will arrange for a car to take them there. You will personally call me when they are on board, and that jet is taxiing to the runway. A private jet. It was an act of pure punitive dominance. A final humiliating stamp on Thorne's defeat. It will be done, Thorne said, a broken man, and Marcus Robert added, as a final thought. Call me Rob again, and I'll buy your airline out from under you just so I can sell it for parts. He hung up. The next hour was a blur for Ava and Mia. A frantic, apologetic senior manager from Global Wings appeared, his face slick with sweat. He informed them that a car was waiting to take them to a private terminal. He couldn't meet their eyes. Then Karen Miller was brought to them. She looked smaller now, stripped of her uniform jacket and her authority. Her face was pale, her eyes red-rimmed. She stood before them, flanked by 2 stone-faced executives. I have been asked to apologize, she stammered, reading from a script of pure corporate damage control. I regret the misunderstanding that led to you missing your flight. Ava stared at her. There was no remorse in the woman's eyes, only the bitter resentment of someone who'd been caught. The apology was as hollow as the random check excuse had been. Do you know why you're apologizing? Ava asked, her voice quiet and clear. Karen Miller looked confused. For the inconvenience? Ava shook her head slowly. No. You're apologizing because my father is Robert Sinclair. If he was Robert Smith, a plumber from Queens, you wouldn't be here. You'd be laughing about it with your friends. And we'd be trying to figure out how to get a last-minute flight in economy. You're not sorry for what you did. You're just sorry for who you did it to. The truth of the statement hung in the air, sharp and undeniable. Karen Miller had no answer. She was escorted away a ghost at her own execution. The car that collected them was a black Mercedes S-Class. It whisked them away from the chaos of the main terminal to the hushed, exclusive world of private aviation. There, waiting on the tarmac, was a sleek, impossibly beautiful Gulfstream jet. As they boarded, the flight attendant greeted them by name, her smile genuine and warm. The cabin was a world of cream leather and polished mahogany. A full meal from a Michelin-starred restaurant was laid out for them. They were the only passengers. The jet took off with a powerful, quiet surge. Below them, London sparkled like a discarded diamond necklace. They were safe. They were vindicated. Their father had moved the heavens and the earth to protect them. But as they sat in the opulent silence, cruising at 40,000 feet, there was no sense of triumph. The victory felt strangely empty. Mia picked at her gourmet meal, her appetite gone. Ava stared out the window at the endless dark ocean. The humiliation at the gate had been a sharp, hot wound. This solution, this overwhelming display of power and wealth, felt like a cold, heavy blanket being draped over it. It didn't heal the wound, it just hid it from view. They were flying home in a gilded cage, acutely aware that the justice they had received was not a justice available to everyone. It was a special kind of justice, one you had to be able to afford. And as they flew westward into the night, neither of them could shake the unsettling feeling that the price for this justice had not yet been fully paid. The story broke just as the Sinclair's private jet touched down at Teterboro Airport in New Jersey. At first, the narrative was exactly what Robert had intended. The initial headlines were explosive Tycoon grounds, airline after daughters face racist treatment. Global Wings air issues. Groveling apology to Sinclair twins. CEO's revenge. How one father took on an airline and won. The initial wave of public opinion was a tidal wave of support for the Sinclairs. On social media, justice for Ava and Amara trended. People shared their own stories of airline mistreatment. The firing of Karen Miller was celebrated as a righteous victory against prejudice. The Sinclairs were cast as heroes in a modern-day David and Goliath story, except David had an arsenal of Boeing 747s. Robert felt a grim satisfaction. He had protected his family. He had meted out justice. When he hugged his daughters on the tarmac, seeing the relief on their faces, he felt he had done the right thing. His wife Eleanor, a sharp and thoughtful woman who had spent the early part of her career as a civil rights attorney, held them all her relief palpable. But the world moves fast, and narratives are fragile things. The ecosystem of outrage is always hungry for a new angle, a new villain. And Robert Sinclair's sledgehammer solution had created ripples he had not foreseen. The shift began with a single, heartbreaking story out of Chicago. A local news station reported on a woman named Sarah Jenkins, a 45-year-old nurse and single mother. Her own mother was in palliative care in a small town in rural England. Sarah had scraped together every penny she had for a last-minute Global Wings flight to say her final goodbyes. Her flight was one of the first to be cancelled due to the operational failure. There were no other flights available that she could afford. She was stuck. She missed her mother's death by 12 hours. The gut punch of the story was in the details. The reporter discovered that the specific reason for the cancellation was a grounded Ethelred charter flight out of O'Hare. And what was on that flight, not just routine aircraft parts, but a shipment of specialized palliative care medication ordered urgently by the very hospice where Sarah's mother lay dying. The story went viral. The hashtag changed. Justice for Ava. And Mia was slowly but surely replaced by #grounded by Sinclair. Suddenly the narrative wasn't about a racist gate agent anymore. It was about a billionaire who in a fit of pique held the world hostage. Who was Robert Sinclair to decide that his daughter's hurt was more important than a dying woman's final hours with her child? Who was he to disrupt the lives of thousands of ordinary people, people who couldn't just charter a G650 when their flight was cancelled? The media, sensing the tide turning, pounced. Op-eds appeared in the New York Times and the Wall Street Journal. The tyranny of the 1%. When personal justice becomes public harm. The Sinclair syndrome power privilege and the weaponization of logistics. The public apology from Global Wings Air, which had initially seemed like a victory, was now reframed as evidence of Sinclair's bullying. Karen Miller, the fired gate agent, was tracked down by a populist news network. On camera, she was no longer a petty tyrant, but a sympathetic figure, a working-class woman, a widow just trying to do her job, who made a mistake and was now being crucified by a powerful oligarch. A GoFundMe for her legal fees and emotional distress raised over $200,000 in 2 days. She was being rewarded for the very act that had caused the entire firestorm. The karma was not swift and clean. It was messy, insidious, and it hit the Sinclair family from all sides. The atmosphere in their sprawling Central Park West apartment grew thick with unspoken tension. The celebratory mood had evaporated, replaced by something heavy and sour. The real drama was no longer playing out on the news, but in the quiet, painful conversations within their own home. Eleanor confronted Robert one evening in his study, the city lights twinkling below like a silent, judging audience. She had been a ghost of herself for days, her face etched with a familiar disappointment. "Did you ever once think it through, Rob?" she asked, her voice quiet, but laced with the precision of a seasoned lawyer. "Did you think about the pilots, the flight attendants, the baggage handlers who were stranded? Did you think about the family missing a wedding, the student missing an exam, the sick woman waiting for medicine?" "I thought about our daughters." Robert countered, his voice defensive. "I thought about what was done to them." "No," Eleanor said, shaking her head, her eyes flashing with a righteous fire he hadn't seen since her courtroom days. "That's what you tell yourself. You did this for you, for your pride. An injustice was done, a real and ugly one. The right response was to demand accountability, to use our resources to force a change in policy to seek a meaningful systemic solution. But you didn't want a solution. You wanted a victory. You wanted to burn their house down. You used a nuclear bomb to kill a fly, Rob, and now we're all living in the fallout." Ava was walking past the study and heard her mother's words. You wanted to burn their house down. The vindication she had felt curdled into a deep, sickening guilt. Her mother was right. The scale of her father's response felt less and less like protection, and more like a monstrous overreaction. The humiliation at the gate had been horrible, but was it worth a dying woman not seeing her daughter? The question was a poisoned dart in her conscience. Mia retreated even further. She stopped sketching. She barely touched the piano. The incident at the airport had confirmed her deepest fears about the world, that it was a place of casual cruelty. But the aftermath was worse. It suggested that their very existence, their family's power and wealth, was a source of collateral damage to others. They were no longer just victims. They were, in the eyes of the world, part of the problem. The thought paralyzed her. Their summer at Juilliard, once a shining beacon, now felt tainted, a privilege bought at a terrible public cost. The karma was hitting Robert at the office too. The board of Ethelred Logistics was in open revolt. David Chen had tried to warn him. "They're terrified," Rob David said in an emergency meeting. "Our brand is built on one word: reliability. You single-handedly turned our greatest asset into a weapon." Other clients, airlines, tech companies, and medical consortiums are spooked. They're asking if we could do this to them if one of their employees looks at you the wrong way. We've had 3 major clients activate clauses in their contracts to review our partnership. The financial hit from the grounding is manageable. The reputational damage, that's a different story. Robert, who had always commanded the absolute loyalty of his board, walked into the emergency meeting to find a room of cold, hostile faces. They were no longer looking at him as their visionary leader. They were looking at him as a liability. The man who grounded Global Wings was about to be grounded himself. The power he had wielded so absolutely was slipping through his fingers. And the hardest part was that he had done it to himself. The consequences were coming home to roost, not just in the court of public opinion, but in the very empire he had built. The final act of the drama was not a swift, clean execution. It was death by 1,000 cuts, a slow, grinding erosion of a family's identity. The karma that returned to the House of Sinclair was not a spectacular lightning bolt of retribution, but a suffocating atmospheric pressure that permeated every corner of their lives, finding every crack in their foundation and pressing until it crumbled. The public backlash mutated from a social media trend into a tangible physical siege. Their address, once a symbol of New York prestige, became a destination. Paparazzi, no longer content with long lens shots, jostled for position on the sidewalk, their flashes like strobing interrogation lamps. But they were the lesser evil. The protesters were a constant presence, their numbers swelling and waning with the daily news cycle. They were a chorus of public condemnation, their chants echoing up the canyon of Central Park West. "Justice for Jenkins!" they'd shout, their voices raw. "The 1% is the real emergency." Eleanor stood by the thick, sound-proofed window one afternoon, watching them. A young woman held a professionally printed sign with a picture of Sarah Jenkins, the nurse, on one side, and a caricature of Robert as a corpulent king on the other. The slogan read, "He flies, private your mother, dies alone." The cruelty was so direct, so personal, it stole the air from Eleanor's lungs. She saw her husband, not as the world now saw him, but as the man who stayed up all night to help the girls build a ridiculously complex solar system model for their 5th grade science fair. The disconnect between the private man she loved and the public monster he had become was a chasm that widened with every chant. For Ava and Mia, the fortress of their home was no escape. The siege was digital, and it followed them everywhere. Their names, once a source of pride, were now anchors of shame. The first day of the Juilliard summer program, a day they had dreamed of for years, felt like a walk to the gallows. As they entered the hallowed halls of the Lincoln Center campus, the whispers were immediate and undeniable. They saw the other students, young, brilliant artists like themselves, glance up from their phones, their expressions a mixture of awe, contempt, and morbid curiosity. In their chamber music orientation, the instructor, a kind but oblivious man, asked everyone to introduce themselves. When Ava said Ava Sinclair, a distinct, uncomfortable silence fell over the room. A boy in the back row let out a low whistle. Later in the practice rooms, Ava overheard 2 violinists talking. Can you believe it? Their dad literally broke an airline because they were inconvenienced. My parents had to take out a 2nd mortgage for me to be here. Ava's instinct was to fight back, to defend her father, to explain the ugliness of the initial incident. But how could she? The narrative was too big, too powerful. Her humiliation at Heathrow felt petty and small when weighed against a missed deathbed goodbye. So she stewed in a silent, defensive rage. Mia, however, simply broke. Her spirit, already bruised by the incident at the gate, was shattered by the public shaming. She, who communicated best through the 88 keys of a piano, found herself unable to play. She would sit at the Steinway in their apartment, her hands hovering over the keys. But the music was gone. All she could hear were the hateful words from her phone, the messages that slipped past her privacy filters. Hope you enjoyed your private jet, you spoiled brat. Sarah Jenkins' mother is dead because of you. Go back to London, no one wants you here. The art that had been her soul's expression was now just a reminder of a dream that had turned to ash. She felt like a fraud, a child of unearned privilege, whose very presence in a place like Juilliard was an insult to those who had truly earned it. Robert Sinclair, meanwhile, faced his own reckoning in the silent, air-conditioned chill of the Ethelred boardroom. He had walked into this room as a king for 20 years. Today he entered as a defendant. The faces that greeted him were not of colleagues, but of a jury. His old friend and board chairman, Michael Vance, a man whose children had grown up with his, did not meet his eye. Robert tried to mount a defense. He spoke with a passion that felt hollow even to his own ears. He talked about brand values, about taking a stand against the kind of insidious racism the tarnished corporate images. He even tried to frame it as a stress test of their logistical network, yielding valuable data. He was grasping, and everyone knew it. When he finished, there was a long, painful silence. Then Michael Vance cleared his throat and spoke, his voice heavy with a regret that made the words cut even deeper. "Rob, we're not debating racism. What happened to your girls was appalling. No one here disputes that. We're debating judgment. Your judgment." He slid a tablet across the polished table. A graph showed Ethelred's stock price, a precipitous cliff appearing 3 days prior. "This," Michael said, tapping the graph, "is a multi-billion-dollar loss in shareholder value. But it's more than that. I spent all of yesterday on the phone with the CEO of Medstream Alliance. They're our biggest medical supply client. He wanted to know, and I quote, if our supply of transplant organs is subject to the mood of Mr. Sinclair's family. He was activating the 90-day review clause in their contract. OmniCloud and Aerolease have done the same. You didn't just use our company as a weapon, Rob. You told our most important clients that our promise of reliability, the very bedrock of this company, can be revoked at your personal whim. You betrayed the trust of our clients, our shareholders, and the 20,000 employees whose livelihoods depend on that trust." He paused and finally looked Robert in the eye. "The board has held a vote. We are invoking moral turpitude and breach of fiduciary duty. We are asking for your immediate resignation as Chief Executive Officer. You can retain the honorary title of founder and a non-executive seat out of respect for what you built. But your authority, your control, it's over." Robert felt the floor drop out from beneath him. He looked around the room at the men he had made rich, the men he had mentored, and saw no allies. He was an emperor who had been peacefully, bloodlessly, and unanimously deposed. In his quest to demonstrate his absolute power to his daughters, he had been rendered utterly powerless. The final, most exquisite turn of karma's screw came a week later. The populist news network that had championed Karen Miller aired its prime-time special. It was a masterpiece of manipulative storytelling. It opened with soft focus shots of Karen in her small, tidy garden, her hands tending to roses as she spoke of her late husband. She was framed not as an agent of prejudice, but as a diligent, if flustered, working woman caught in an impossible situation. All I knew was that the system flagged the tickets for additional checks, she said, a carefully rehearsed tear rolling down her cheek. With security alerts being what they are, I had to follow protocol. I have a mortgage to pay. I couldn't risk my job by making an exception. There was, of course, no mention of her sneering tone, her condescending questions, or the triumphant look in her eyes. The host nodded sympathetically. "So you were just a casualty, a working woman, steamrolled by a billionaire who didn't like the rules." "I just pray for the family," Karen said, a beatific look of forgiveness on her face. "They must be going through so much." The special ended with a stunning announcement. Ethelred's biggest competitor, Atlas Worldwide Shipping, had hired Karen Miller as their new Director of Customer Relations for the entire European sector. The CEO of Atlas appeared on camera praising her grace under pressure and her commitment to procedural integrity. It was a cynical, brilliant PR move, a middle finger to Robert Sinclair, and a way to position Atlas as the champion of the common man. Karen Miller hadn't just been exonerated, she had been promoted, her prejudice laundered into a virtue. That night, the Sinclair apartment was a tomb. The news of Karen's new job was the final crushing blow. It confirmed that the world was not just that actions did not have equal and opposite reactions. Robert found his daughters in the living room, staring blankly at the city lights. He felt the full, crushing weight of his failure. It wasn't the loss of his company or his reputation that gutted him. It was the look in his children's eyes. He had tried to slay a dragon for them, and in doing so had become a monster himself, burning down not only his own kingdom, but their peace of mind along with it. He sat down, not in his usual armchair of authority, but on the ottoman at their feet. The apology he had rehearsed, full of justifications, died in his throat. All that was left was the raw, ugly truth. "I was wrong," he began, his voice cracking. "There is no excuse. I saw your pain, and it made me blind with rage. I wanted to make them pay. I wanted the world to see what they had done. But I used my power like a club, not a scalpel. I wasn't seeking justice for you. I was seeking revenge for me and my pride, my arrogance. It hurt you more than that woman at the gate ever could have. It hurt people who did nothing wrong. I broke the world a little bit, and I broke our family. And I am so sorry." Mia, who had been silent for days, began to weep deep, shuddering sobs of released grief. Ava, whose anger had been a shield, finally let it fall. She didn't move to comfort her father, but she didn't pull away either. The path forward started there, in that moment of shared brokenness. It was Eleanor who suggested the foundation, not as a press release, but as a penance. They would fund it anonymously. They named its primary initiative the Jenkins Grant, a perpetual fund dedicated to providing emergency travel and logistical aid for families needing to reach loved ones in end-of-life care. It didn't fix anything. It didn't erase the damage or silence the protesters. But it was a start. It was the first step away from the grand, destructive gestures of power and toward the quiet, difficult, and deeply human work of making amends. The real-life drama was over. The lifetime of living with its consequences had just begun. What a story. It's a parent's worst nightmare and a CEO's ultimate power fantasy rolled into one, but with a twist of karma that feels chillingly real. It forces us to ask some difficult questions. Where is the line between justice and revenge? And in our modern world, does immense power ever come without a terrible price? The story of the Sinclair family shows how a single act of prejudice can ignite a firestorm, but also how a response, even with the best intentions, can create a blaze that consumes everything in its path, including the people you were trying to protect. It's a raw and powerful lesson in consequences. What do you think? Was Robert Sinclair justified in his actions, or did his rage create a bigger injustice? Let us know your thoughts in the comments below. These are the conversations we need to be having. If this story moved you, please hit that like button. Share it with someone who appreciates a complex real-life drama, and make sure you subscribe to the channel for more stories that go beyond the headlines. Your support helps us continue to bring these powerful narratives to light. Thank you for listening.